bit in to keep us to think, as in, where do we want to go if we make policies? And the tendency to mix outputs, in this case, net enrollment in education, and outcomes, in this case, improvement in our health status. And the other two, as I indicated, which talks about water and sanitation and improvement in the quality of education, which in itself is not a metric. But what is important for us in this quote is the measurement of happiness, and tailors the measurement of happiness to our ability to manage our own lives. One of the things that I grapple with as government statistician is, what does inflation mean to us? What does GDP mean to us? It has to translate into something. And that thing that it has to translate it into is livelihood transformation, the impacts that I'm talking about, happiness, the impact that I'm talking about. So far back in 1957, our first president knew that all the conversation should be around a metric-centric conversation. You cannot think about your progress if you don't measure that progress. And don't only measure the progress from the output perspective, but indeed measure the progress from the outcome and impact perspective. So we've known this. The beauty about this is that government upon government, we've realized this importance. So our current president, His Excellency of the Republic, in 2017, during his inaugural speech, his swearing-in speech, quoted this same part and precisely left out the bit which says that we shall measure our progress by the happiness which our people have in managing their own lives. So it is something that has been with us. So the three things that I use as indicators for us to reflect on from the perspectives of outcomes and impact, livelihood transformation, economic development, and happiness. So I get into my first slide, and the next 14 or so slides, I'm going to show you some numbers to engage our responses as in whether Ghana's development can be characterized as a paradox and whether we really understand the Ghanaian economy. So in March 2022, we got the 10th anniversary, the happiness report. And on the left-hand side, what you see is the rank of 150 countries. And from the 2022 report, Ghana is positioned 111. From the score point of view, which is scored between 0 and 10, what is technically telling us that from 2008, where we sourced the data, up until the current period, that is 2021, indeed, from those two endpoints, our happiness score has gone down from 4.5 to 4.4. That is not the emphasis of my message. The emphasis of my message on this slide is the fluctuations in happiness, which I always argue that you are better off having a consumption smoothing experience when you are below a certain line, which we call, let's say, a poverty line, rather than what we are experiencing as in fluctuations in our happiness. In this lecture, I do not interrogate the numbers, but I give you a sense where these numbers are coming from, but indeed, I would interrogate these numbers in my subsequent lectures. So the happiness score is being championed by Jeffrey Sachs and some colleagues from the Columbian University in the United States. And they use 6 indicators. As a quantitative person, I'm hesitant dealing with subjective measurements. But of the 6 indicators, 2 of them are quantitative oriented, specifically the GDP that is sourced from the World Development Indicators and what they call the Healthy Life Expectancy Index, which they get from the World Health Organization. The 4 other indices that they use in the computation of happiness are as follows. And it ties into what our first president talks about. The first has to do with the freedom to which you have in assessing your life, in making your life. So they ask a simple question to 1,000 people in every that you have, are you satisfied to the extent to which you make decisions? Over a 1 month, over a 12-month period, a question is posed as in, if you are in trouble, will you get somebody to assist? The last two indicators that they use subjectively are generosity, which indeed is based on whether you've given out to a charitable home in the past 12 months or not. They run a regression on that, on GDP per capita, and use the residual as the measure for generosity. And the fourth variable is the perception of corruption. So it's a combination of four subjective measures and two objective measures, as I indicated. So we can draw all the conclusions that it has its biases, but as a global community, it is relying on one of the prime indicators for measuring progress quantitatively, which is GDP per capita. I quickly walk through other variants of the happiness index. Here are the 6 indicators that I talk about. You see them showing, and it's added a 7th one, which is the residual term, which would allow all countries to have a score at least 0 or above, which they call the dystopia, which is simply the state or the state opposite to a utopian situation, ideal situation. So to enable every country to have at least 0 and above, the state of dystopia, which is the barest minimum number that you can get, is put on it. And the residual, which is what we cannot explain from the 6 indicators that I talked about, is added to it. From this, you see how Ghana fares across the 6 indicators. We score very high from the perspective of generosity, and our worst performance in terms of ranking is from the social support. My concern across these dimensions, it's not the absolute cause. My concern on these dimensions is the components that we cannot explain. So on this slide, I revisit the 6 indicators plus the 7th item, which I refer to as, which is referred to us in the report as a state of dystopia, or the residual term, which is the term that we cannot explain, is 40%. So from the happiness score, the first point that I put to the fore is that 40% of the happiness that persons in Ghana experience cannot be explained. The other 60% is shared across the 6 domains, ranging from GDP per capita to perceptions in corruption. I turn down to the main indicator that we use, Ghana Statistical Service quarterly, annually, we release gross domestic product quarterly and on an annual basis. So the first take-home message is the unexplained part I've emphasized. The second message is about the volatilities. So I'm going to show you a few graphs suggesting that every macroeconomic indicator that is market-driven is highly volatile, starting with GDP per capita. So if you look at GDP per capita, since 1960, when we gained our independence, up until now, has been very volatile. The third point, the unexplained part, the volatility part, the third point to do with the choice of users of data's initial condition. So if you look at the volatility of GDP per capita, as a researcher, I can make a decision that, let me not think about anything from 1990. So anything before 1990, when we saw contractions right from 1965, it's peaking in 1975, 82. Let's forget about that period. Let us think about Ghana's economy from 1990, and all the growth that we recorded since then are above 0, so we're thinking about the expansion period. So policymakers, researchers, always would want to play around the initial conditions. And one of the questions that I pose is, i.e. an Eurobond, as an example, for 3, 2 years, you're only going to see the impact after creation of the financial instrument that you have, in which case it will have an impact after 5 years, after 10 years. The conversations around initial conditions are missing. On the right-hand side, I show 2 things about public debt. It's already in the public domain. Ghana's debt as a proportion of GDP is high. So I show you two things. The point where Ghana decided to go to the IMF into the heavily indebted poor country initiative around 2000. If you look at where we peaked in terms of levels, we are just around the same point now. So here what you see is around 2000 we peaked, we got into the HIPIC initiative, and currently where we have in terms of general government debt, we are just around the same. So conversations has already ensued as to whether we should go back or not. But one of the things that doesn't come to the fore for discussion is the distinction between levels and growth. Fourth point. So in terms of levels, we are there. But the dotted line that you see on the right-hand side is talking about the growth in our GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP. So from a growth point of view, we are nowhere close to the levels. So any conversation trying to understand the Ghanaian economy should not focus on only levels where we are and make an argument. As I said, step back, think about the initial conditions, which is the basis of your growth, to make a decision on where you want to go. Two other macroeconomic indicators that I share. On the left-hand side is the gross fixed capital formation, which is simply referred to as investment. So think about your own business. You invest capital into it, and you expect some returns. So at the national level, we call it the produced assets. So here we capture only assets that are acquired for purposes of production. And we discount it with all disposals. And then we are doing that as a proportion of GDP. With this particular indicator, there's nothing like the level which is desired. Because at any point in time, it depends on the extent to which you are investing and the extent to which your GDP is growing. But one of the basic things that every economic student will learn, either in level 100 or level 200, is what is called, from a macroeconomics point of view, is what is called the Solo model or the Romes model, which talks about a steady growth path or a balanced growth path. Keep in mind the volatilities that we saw in GDP and see what we are seeing, investment as a proportion of GDP and the volatilities that we are seeing. Until you get a smooth, steady, balanced growth path, which is the basis for making a determination on what is going to happen, these volatilities will never permit you to understand the outturn of any policy that you institute. And in Ghana, we've never had a consistent showdown, a steady path, balanced growth path when we look at our simple capital over our income. So that basic model simply says that capital and income should grow at the same rate. Once that happens, the ratio between that would be constant. But if they are growing at different rates, which are not predictable, you're going to see these volatilities that we have. And on the right-hand side, I have real effective exchange rate. This is something that it's on the table for discussion. The central bank is doing all that it has to do to slow down the extent to which it is depreciating. Keeping in mind the topic, conceptualization of national policies. So I ask myself, what are the two major policies that we have put in place from the perspective of exchange rate? The first one occurred in 82, 83, when as a country we decided to move away from a fixed exchange rate regime to a flexible exchange rate regime. So we started with pacing out that transition. First of all, through a semi-flexible, and currently what we are experiencing, a fully fledged flexible exchange rate regime. This was a direct policy, so you see the sharp drop between 1982 and 1983, falling from in excess of 3,050 indices to about 4,080 indices. The next major policy was around the redenomination of the currency in 2007. And the question that I ask, between 83 and 2007 and post-2007 and now, can one draw the conclusion that the redenomination has impacted in terms of trends. Has seen a favorable outcome in terms of trends. I believe the trends speaks for themselves. Then I turn to two other macroeconomic variables. One has to do with the minimum wage and the other inflation. And I look at minimum wage from two perspectives. Currently, our minimum wage is 13 Ghana cedis 53, having risen from 11 Ghana cedis 82 in 2020 to 12 Ghana cedis 53 in 2021, and currently 13 Ghana cedis 53 in 2022. And the question that I put to the fore is how inflation is impacting between nominal minimum wage and real minimum wage. Based on data from the World Development Indicators, we see a drop from the 1182 minimum wage that was recorded or that was put out in 2022 to just about 3 Ghana cedis with a consumer price index of 305. You see that the effect, nominal and real. I hesitate in advancing this argument strongly. In this lecture, as I indicated, I'm not interrogating the numbers. Today, Ghana Statistical Service released consumer price index and rate of inflation, and the rate of inflation for the month of March 2022 stood at 148.8. And if you go down the history of Ghana Statistical Service data, our annual CPI for 2020 was just around 112, as against the 305 that is being reported by the World Development Index. The question that I ask myself, and I know my colleague academics would always say, let's use the data that is available. World Development Indicators. We can easily assess it. If they are putting 305 for Ghana and indeed is 148, who should be concerned? Indeed, our data says 148, so that's it. This is the part of conversation that is not happening. If we leave the World Development Indicators to continue to do projections from unemployment perspective, CPI perspective, and put out these numbers to the World Bank to make a determination that Ghana is a lower middle income country. In that case, your debt situation will be treated differently from when you are a low income country. We need to work towards the agenda of building our central base. And that is why Ghana Statistical Service is taking on that initiative. For the first time, we're going to hire a macroeconomist, and all that we're going to do is to mimic the WDI data, the World Development Indicators data. With what we have at Ghana Statistical Service, empower our policymakers on the negotiation table to say that CPI is not 305, CPI is 148.8. If there's been any adjustments, these are the contexts in which we need to look at these adjustments. And this is where we need to look at our capacity for policymaking in terms of negotiations. I run through the next two slides, the structure of the economy, leading to my discussions on how we want to treat the low tax that Ghana is an agrarian economy. From both an employment perspective and from an output perspective, Ghana can no more be classified as an agrarian economy. Because from an employment perspective, we see the services sector taking the lead in excess of 50%, having risen from 27%, more than doubling over the 30-year period up to the current 53%. And from an output point of view, we see the dominance of the services sector currently standing at 47.6, relative to 20 and 30, respectively, for the agricultural and services sector. So clearly, Ghana is no more an agrarian economy, it's a service-led economy. Where we do not have detailed conversation is within these subsectors, what is driving each of them. And within the services sector, you see the component that has the highest contribution is trade, repair of vehicles, and household goods. And the question that I ask myself is, what is the amount of tax that we're going to get from there? Within the industry sector, where we see about 30% contribution, we see the mining and the manufacturing sectors driving the industry sector's contribution of 30%. When we are not processing our natural resources, the only source of tax is export duties. Once we explore them, we take them out, it's a one-time tax. Tax GDP ratio will be low. Least we talk about agriculture, the better. Then on this slide, I show you the proportion of the employed population that are contributing to our GDP. So if you look at our GDP computation, 75% of this is captured from the formal sector. And again, from a residual point of view, we put about a quarter, specifically 26.3 for 2020, to the informal sector. So from a contribution point of view, we have 75% from the formal sector. How many people are in the informal sector? We're talking about less than 25%. So it's just 22.4 people who are contributing more than 3/4 of our GDP. What is happening in the informal sector, which is about 77.1, is only contributing just about a quarter to our GDP. And as I indicated, this is coming from the residual perspective. So given this background on the structure of the economy, I'll walk you through the tax GDP ratio. E-levy, we all have discussed it, we all are excited about it. It's definitely going to impact in terms of trends because it's a new tax component. It's going to show a spike. But as an academic, the question that I ask is, what has been the historical experience? We see that right from 2008 up until now, tax GDP ratio has almost halved from 24% to just about 12%. The question that I ask myself is, if over this 12-13-year period, it's dropped by about 13 percentage points, indicating about 1 percentage point each year. If we introduce e-levy and we see the spike, just as we saw oil spiking GDP to 14.1% in 2011, and going by the historical trend of halving tax GDP ratio between 2008 and 2020, it means over a period of time, we're going to see the spike that the e-levy would bring about gradually slowing down. What we need to think about if we want to understand the economy is historically what has accounted for the halving of tax GDP ratio over the last 12 years. I look at this from the perspective of the two variables, taxes and GDP. What you clearly see that over the period while taxes have gone up by just 9 percentage points over the 12-year period, we see GDP going up by 21 percentage points. So the proportional growth between taxes and GDP have not been the same. And that is what is culminating in the halving of the tax GDP ratio over the same period. Keep in mind that one of the things that I talk about when I start discussing the policy is that thinking about the macroeconomy is not about ratios. I touch on my favorite topic, poverty. We don't see a linear reduction in poverty over the period. We see a nonlinear trend over the period, while we see a sharp drop from the first time that we did a living standard survey, that was around 1975, with a poverty incidence of 75%. We see a sharp drop up to 36.9 when we did the first Ghana Living Standard Survey. Following from that, we saw an upward trend up until 1991-92, when it rose to 51.7%. And then subsequently, it has declined. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I emphasize the rate of decline at different levels. Ghana was touted as one of the countries having achieved the first goal of the Millennium Development, which was halving poverty between 1990 and 2015. By 2012, as you can see, Ghana had halved poverty from 51.7 to 24.2. After that, what happened? Over a five-year period, we only saw a 0.8 percentage drop in our poverty incidence, persons living above the poverty line. What accounted for the halving of poverty in excess of 20 percentage points between the period 1991 and 2012-2013. We need to provide a historical account. I'll give you a sense of how GDP translates into poverty. So in economics, we have what we call the growth elasticity of poverty. So simply, our interest is starting with the argument that anytime there is growth, two things happen: redistribution of resources and seeing a reduction in poverty. We see that redistribution over the period has been on ascendancy, so we are seeing the red flags for the periods 2012-2013 and 2016-2017. So it is a disincentive to the growth that we are seeing. But how are we translating our GDP growth to reduction in poverty? And that is the question that we always face at the service. Following our last 2 rounds of the Ghana Living Standard Survey, we saw for every 1% change in GDP, poverty dropped by 0.17%. This is what happened from the 2012-2013. Keep in mind that between 1991-1992, we have poverty from 51.7 to 24.2. But from 2012 to 2016-2017, it was only a 0.8 change. So the impact of GDP on poverty was only 0.7. So anytime you see a 1% GDP growth rate, for that period, it contributed to only a 0.7 reduction in our poverty. What historical account are we giving to this? This is confirmed by what I said earlier on. Consistently, our income inequality, our Gini coefficient, has gone up. One of the conclusions that I draw from this first part of the lecture is that Ghana's economic experience is at variance with economic theory. And this is one of the very fundamental things that we get to learn when you are doing development economics. And this is what is called the Kuznets curve. At your early stages of your growth, you want to see inequality going up. It is expected because people are increasing their productivity, redistribution is yet to occur. But if you sustain growth, not the volatilities that I showed, if you sustain growth for a longer period of time, we have what we call the inverted U. Goes up at early stages of your growth, it reaches its peak following the sustaining of your economic growth, and we expect inequality to fall. We are not yet there. Keep in mind the first question. As hard as I tried to behave like a macroeconomist, as you heard from the Vice Chancellor, my orientation is micro-development economics and more of micro-econometrics. I wanted to move away from micro data, especially from the unemployment perspective, but I couldn't resist the temptation. And let me tell you, one of the reasons why I move away from macroeconomics is that in the literature we call them false prophets. And anytime you put them in a room, they're going to contradict because of the unwittingly complications, complexities that they tend to get into when they start discussing the economy. So from an unemployment perspective, from the 2021 population housing census, 13.4%. I relate this slide to a number of things, one of which is inequality. I talked about inequality initially from the income perspective. We present a national figure of 13.4 without interrogating what is happening with different age groups and what is happening across the different geographical spaces. I saw these numbers with a lot of surprise, and it's my prayer and hope that policymakers would also see these numbers with a lot of surprise. Think about a national figure of 13.4 when the district with least poverty is about 3.7, and the district with the worst poverty is about 45%. So you see Namdam to the far right, and we see district in Oti region to the far left. Indeed, all districts in Oti region are recording unemployment figures lower than the national average. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the irony here is that the district that has the highest inequality is just as poor, deprived, as the district that has the lowest unemployment. It is happening in OT, which is one of the regions that is most deprived, that is one of the regions that have the least poverty indices. This is the conundrum that we need to deal with as macroeconomists. So you don't use one macroeconomic indicator and more worryingly, use that macroeconomic indicator at the aggregated level. Indeed, what is happening in OT region is that everybody, including children, actually from the census, is the region that is engaging the most number of children. So everybody in there is engaging in an economic activity. So if you go there, have you worked in the last 1 week for at least 1 hour? Everybody, including children who have to be in school, are working. So you see the least unemployment indices are happening around OT. We don't use one indicator to make a judgment as far as dealing with an economy is concerned. What are my conclusions, distinguished ladies and gentlemen? Stock volatility suggests weaknesses in policies achieving long-term outcomes. Happiness, livelihood transformation, and economic development, and being modest and careful say that, I'm not saying they've not occurred, I'm saying they are yet to occur. I'm pretty confident that it would occur but one day. There are clearly contradictions in GDP and other macroeconomic indicators. I've demonstrated that very well. The performance of the Ghanaian economy, as I indicated, is at variance with economic theory. What we are not doing, which this lecture is proposing to do, with Ghana Statistical Service taking the lead, is to provide a macroeconomic toolbox. So anytime a policymaker brings up one macroeconomic indicator, we are working with the telecos to enable persons in Ghana on their phones assess all the macroeconomic indicators. So just as I've shown to you, somebody says unemployment, ask about inflation. Somebody says nominal minimum wage. In June, we're going to go into a tripartite discussion to think about our new minimum wage. Think about the effect of inflation of that. We need to get a macroeconomic toolbox accessible to persons in Ghana to enable them interrogate the complexities around macroeconomic indicators. Lastly, I say that understanding the economy to inform policy requires an eclectic approach. This is what I indicated earlier on. You might by now, and in the next slide, going to be convinced that macroeconomics turns very complicated unwittingly when you think about all the variables at a go. So we need an eclectic approach. And what I precisely mean here is that let us not allow policymakers alone. If they've allowed themselves to think about it, academic, let's get ourselves involved. Let's get views from diverse people, look at issues from different sources to help address our context. Chair, with your permission, I drift on to the second component of my lecture, which has to do with how people discuss the economy. And as I indicated, I'll follow that up with what I've been doing over the past 17 years of being in the academic world in terms of how conceptual frameworks have been developed and get us to appreciate the complexities in dealing with economic variables. How have people obtained knowledge on the economy? I identify 3 strands broadly. You are either hit by a shock, like COVID-19 came through, and spontaneously you need to make some decisions. So in that event, it's not about what the theory says, it's not about what the data is. You go about and either do copycast or copy and paste or do a knee-jerk approach in coming up with policies. My argument here is that even if that is pardonable, which under the circumstance one would give relief to that intervention, it has to be followed by either a theoretical approach or a data-driven monitoring approach. The concern here is when we begin to offset the use of data. and begin to think about anecdotal evidence, my personal experiences in the past, what I know, the subjective perspective in terms of how the economy would have to run. This is why I said, after all these years of training in economics and practicing, it is about time I do an inaugural lecture on the data policy transition. To begin to think about whether people use data in the first place, how do they use data? And one of the things that I talk about is policymakers are always at liberty to choose how to use data. You can use data from three perspectives. Either ex ante, before you put in a policy, use data to monitor your policy, or use data to say that I did well. The weight of the use of data should be ex ante, rather than doing a policy intervention and ex post when you want to say that indeed we've done well. Policy statisticians, in this case, Ghana Statistical Service and the entire national statistical system is battling with competitors. We see these competitors a lot. I call them social commentators, those who use aspects and the subjective approach. The third thing that I talk about in terms of how we obtain knowledge on the economy is now all of us on the continent obliged to follow the Sustainable Development Goals. All of us obliged to follow the African Agenda 2063. And when I reflect on our own coordinated program of economic and social development policies, an agenda for job creation, wealth creation, and equal opportunity for all, from an academic perspective, I get so excited for 4 reasons. The first reason is what I keep emphasizing. We need a coordinated approach. So from the theme's point of view, it is spot on. We cannot begin to think about policies in isolation. So I commend the government for thinking about the need for a coordinated policy, having it as part of the title for our development agenda. The 3 other reasons is when I put a philosophical perspective to what follows economic and social development policies. The first one is talking about an agenda for jobs. So from a philosophical point of view, it's talking about what is the consequence, what is the outcome. All that we need to do is to get jobs. The second component talks about wealth creation. What is it talking about from a philosophical point of view? Welfarism, utilitarianism. And the third part is talking about equality, an egalitarian society. Any of us who does graduate work aligned to philosophy will begin to think about that is why in higher academic institutions we are aligned to philosophies, thinking that it will generate critical thinking and eventually help us in conceptualizing on what we do. So our coordinated program for economic and social development policies, an agenda for jobs, wealth creation, equal opportunities for all, from the theme's point of view, scores very high. What we need to think about is whether indeed they are coordinated and whether indeed they are achieving their returns. I put forward 6 questions which I'm not going to answer. I leave that to policymakers. I've talked about it. Which statistics is being used? As I said, I'm not interrogating that here. Why are we using that statistic? What is the comparator? What are the limitations and alternatives? What are the philosophical and ideological underpinnings of the policy directives? And finally, what conceptual frameworks guide the policy directives? Chair, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get you to carefully think about the proposal that I'm going to put forward as I walk through 4 conceptual frameworks. So I put to the 4 8 points when we want to think about capacity and practice. The first has to do with our ability to identify the connection between any policy instrument and 3 things: the target, the outcome, and the impact. If you look at the framing of the Sustainable Development Goals, this is the framing of it. You don't think about a policy instrument only at one level. So if we want to begin to think about evaluating policies in Ghana that, from my point of view, should be the first criteria. The second criteria has to do with what is referred to in the policy science literature as the policy sequence and the policy hierarchies. As I go through the conceptual frameworks, I'm going to demonstrate that. Anytime you think about a policy as a standalone policy, and you don't think about how it sequences with other policies and the hierarchies across the different policies, something is missing. And again, I'm going to demonstrate that. Closely related to the sequencing and the hierarchies is the issue of the policy mixes. No standalone policy. At any point in time, you need to think about mixing X number of policies to achieve an end game. That is the third thing that you always need to think about. The fourth thing that I talk about is the timing of policy. Anytime you hear a policy instrument that doesn't have a date that other policies will compete it out, or other natural causes or developmental pathways are going to compete that policy intervention out, begin to suspect the authenticity of that policy. So the fourth thing that I talked about has to do with the timing. The fifth is the cost-benefit analysis, which follows from the mixes of policy instruments. Anytime you see a policy out there that doesn't tell you that we had different options, we chose this option because the cost associated with this option is higher than that, and the benefit is better this way. So moving forward, we want to see the cost benefits associated with these policies. The sixth one that I talk about is what is referred in the literature as the data that underlines the policy intervention. I've made that point. Now we've had E-levy. We've been told it's going to bring us about 6.9 out of it. Two things that comes out of that. That is our baseline figure. Moving forward, what is going to happen to this figure? So you need always to have a data at the baseline, during, and at the end to carefully help us measure that. Once you are able to do that, the seventh criteria is what is referred to in the policy science literature as calibrations of policies. After the town hall engagement, after the back and forth with Parliament on the E-levy, and it finally came to 1.5, wearing my academic hat, I asked myself, the 1.75 was expected to achieve certain policy directives. Now, through engagement with Parliament, town hall, and so on, is now 1.5. What are the outcomes that we are going to compromise? What are the impacts that we are going to compromise? And would it eventually lead to we saying that we are not in a position to achieve the ultimate impact of that intervention? Calibrations. And the final one, which admittedly all my years as an academic I've not done, is what is referred to as the policy space. We put out the policies without thinking about the ideological orientations, the philosophical orientations, the global trends, the legacies that previous policies have left, and then we think that this policy makes sense because we have a probability that is showing 1% significance. Policies don't work like that. Policymakers would always have to think about the policy space, which can be looked at broadly from the perspectives that I've articulated. So I'm going to walk you through these conceptual frameworks, and for each of them, I'm going to elucidate these 8 points. The Vice-Chancellor did indicate that one of the areas that I've engaged in over the period has to do with poverty. So I put up this slide asking myself, we have poverty between 1991 and 2012, from 51.2 to 24.2. We saw that between 2012 and 2016-2017, there was only a 0.8 percentage difference. So we want to address poverty. Policymakers, politicians took credit for the drop in poverty indices in terms of poverty headcount. let's change the definition of poverty, which Ghana Statistical Service in the last 2 years has done. So moving from an income perspective of measuring poverty, we bring to the fore what is multidimensional poverty. And with the 23.4 that we recorded in our last Ghana Living Standard Survey, that is 2016-2017, from the multidimensional point of view, we see 45.6 persons as multidimensionally poor, and another 4.1 that are consumption expenditure poor. If you put the two together, you have about 49 who are poor. So by changing the definition, everything changes. The focus of our conversation here is it's something that you need to address. So you start thinking about how you address it. You think about it from two different perspectives. The first perspective, where we refer to as policies that are influenced by other interventions. So in the literature, we refer to them as endogenous variables. And policies that we came to meet them, they are historical. Think about the initial conditions that I talked about. We do not have control. How do we think about this framework in such a way that policymakers will not only target the endogenous variables, which are the finance, the trade openness, income inequality, but think about the historical factors, which we are referring to them as exogenous variables, and try to deal with the root causes. My colleague econometricians here would bear with me that we hardly estimate more than a one-stage equation, which would help us understand the distant factors, the exogenous factors, how they impact on the endogenous variables, and eventually help us address it. So the conversation here is a twofold. Assuming we move away from income poverty and we are dealing with multidimensional poverty, would the endogenous variables that we've listed there, from the multidimensional poverty perspective, we identify deprivations from the health perspective, from the water and sanitation perspective, and from the education perspective. But from this conceptual framework, we are saying tackle poverty from an income point of view. The policy space, the sequencing, the calibrations, the hierarchies. This is what is missing both in our teaching and practice. So assuming the first conceptual framework was right, you recall that we saw financial development contributing to income and eventually leading to a reduction in poverty. So we frame our thinking around financial development and eventually what it's going to do. Two things. How do you measure financial development? I talked about the same from the perspective of poverty. The central bank will tell us that think about private credit as a proportion of GDP. The macroeconomists will tell you that use broad money supply as a proportion of GDP. When carefully, you can think about financial development from at least three perspectives: the role of financial stability, the role of financial intermediation, and the role of financial assets. Now we're talking about financial inclusion. Now we're talking about financial markets. We're talking about cleaning up. So from these perspectives that you look at financial development, you end up having something different from what is going to achieve the end result. So there's one thing looking at it from the macro level, and there's that other thing looking at it from the micro level. The hierarchies come in here when you think about whether access to finance is all that it takes. I got into microfinance academic debate in 2004, saw it through my PhD in 2010, trained quite a number of PhDs in microfinance. And I look at this framework and I say that you achieve the first one, you enhance access, and make a strong assumption that once access is enhanced, productive investment would occur and eventually is going to facilitate savings and credit. So over the years, this is what I've been battling with. What do we mean by access to finance? Is it because you have a bank account? Is it because a financial institution has your name in their records? What happens with the length of stay that you have with a financial institution? What happens with the purpose of the financial facility that you've received? What happens with the scope of financial services that you have? So academics are at liberty, depending on the availability of data, and from a very simplistic point of view, use a dummy variable to say that once I have my name with a financial institution, I have access, relegating to the background all these questions. The conversation gets more complicated and messy when you think about what I mean by conceptual frameworks, as I indicated earlier on. It is not about definition of concepts. It is about transmission mechanisms. You give somebody access to credit, assuming that it's going to facilitate investment. The person gets a funeral, money would be moved away from the investment to a social investment. And one of my recent PhDs had to do with multiple borrowing among rural women. And this is really what is happening. Because until we cleaned up the financial sector, we had in excess of 3,000 microfinance institutions in the country. Poor rural women borrowing for all different reasons, especially when the policymaker decided not to take into consideration one of the first policy recommendations of having a credit bureau for all microfinance clients in this country, where checks can be done. So once you think about the transmission mechanisms and the risk that are associated with it, then you need some policy making capacity and practice that would help you to adapt to the risk associated with the intervention that you are putting for. So for microfinance to succeed, it has to go through a number of interventions. One of the assumptions is that the environment. So if you look at the World Economic Forum report in 2012, which focuses on financial development index, it says you can only think about financial development when you consider two things: the business environment and the institutional environment. Then you can consider the other 5 indices that are oriented towards financial development. So the thriving of microfinance would only occur if that environment is sound, you have a credit bureau, if the financial institutions have the ability to actually financial intermediate by identifying where we have high returns in our investment and where we have low returns. Then on this slide, my intention is not to walk you through any macroeconomic lecture, but talk about what is the bane of Ghana's development now, which is inflation. I commend the central bank for putting in all the monetary policies from an exchange rate point of view and other monetary instruments to try to address the problem. The root cause of the problem is inadequate revenue mobilization. You link this to the real sector. Think about the 8 dimensions that I talked about. The sequencing, the hierarchies. If you don't address your real sector, revenue mobilization, food is driving inflation. Today we've released inflation figures. Food is standing at 22.4 relative to 17.0 for non-food, culminating 19.4 overall inflation. If you don't sequence the need to deal with the real sector, focusing all our energies on the monetary side of the conversation might not yield us the right returns. Again, I commend the central bank. Anytime it puts up the policy, it tells you that this is a short term, this is a medium term, and this is a long term. It addresses conclude with is the establishment of a national independent academic leaning data policy institute. I got energized with that when I saw what is being done in the Netherlands, where they have something similar, which sits with their parliament. And one of the things that they've done in recent times is to establish what they call the Productivity Board, real sector. Until we tackle issues with the real sector, revenue mobilization, measure productivity across the sectors, which can be done only when you have a hold of your formal sector, our steady state growth path, which is basic economics, the Solo model and the Romance model, our balanced growth path is a bit distant from what we are experiencing now. I move away from all my troubles over the years and I relate to the policy science literature, from which I draw the 8 issues that I talked about, and based on my teaching and closer relationship with policymakers. What I emphasize here is the nested model. So what you see here is thinking about policy capacity from a 3x3 dimension. The 3x3 dimension is starting from the political perspective, the operational perspective, and the analytical perspective. And from these 3 perspectives, you look at it at a hierarchical level. First at the individual level, the program level, the organizational level, and the systemic level. Vice Chancellor, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, 3 things that come out strongly from this literature, which excites me, is 1, what it calls the policy entrepreneurial skills. This is the policy capacity that I'm talking about. The policy entrepreneurial skills. You remember earlier on I mentioned the issue of negotiation. It talks about the issue of agility. It talks about the issue of creativity. And all that can be done when you've acquired that skill over a period of time. The second thing that it talks about is the political acumen, which relates to the design policy space that I talked about. The legacies moving forward, the ideologies that you have. And the third thing that it talks about, which is completely missing in our operations in the country, I'm going to show shortly, has to do with the intra and inter coordination across different government agencies. So on this slide, I list the institutions that are mandated to make policies, the institutions or the persons that are mandated to make policies. Starting with His Excellency the President, who would finally give the assent to it, right to the development authorities. Brilliant. We have it, we get the policies, and taking my conceptual framework thinking to a functional arrangement, organizational functional arrangement, I ask, what is the connection? I put a question mark on National Development Planning Commission, where the chair, Vice Chancellor, and myself are commissioners on there. How do we fit in? How do we integrate? How do we impact? How do we measure our progress? Do we have any database on the number of policies that we make across the different institutions? Which of those policies are informed by data, have yielded the right results? So many unanswered questions. And all this is based on this process of policy making. How do we do the conceptualization? What guides the ratification? Or once the conceptualization is done, the ratification is something that has to occur naturally. During the implementation process, what happens with data? What happens with subjects that are experiencing the policy intervention? Right down to the last 2 questions that are completely missing in our discourse. Do we have the opportunity to measure policy outcomes? C1. Do you have the opportunity to measure the cost of the interventions as against the benefits that accrue from the interventions? As I indicated earlier, I'm yet to see one. So how have we acquired the capacity in making policy? Earlier on that, the teaching of philosophy at the higher degree level. So you have your MPhils, you have your Doctor of Philosophy. Once you orient people to their understanding of what the world is, to their appreciation of what realism is, to their appreciation of what satisfaction is, they can better be informed. It looks like there is something missing with that teaching of philosophy and the skills that we acquire after obtaining the higher degrees, partly affecting the kind of conceptual frameworks that we build to guide our policies. The more contending concern is whether we have to acquire that skills of capacity based on the different subjects that we teach, or based on the research methods, or recently what is evolving in some of the universities called critical thinking. And whether these courses would lend themselves to the 8 issues that I talked about. Can they carefully teach sequencing at that level 200? Can they carefully teach the hierarchies, the mixes, the space, the timing, data informing it, the calibration? Are we confused as an academic community where to place the teaching of policy capacity? These are conversations that I believe Vice Chancellors Ghana, professors would begin to reflect on. I'll give you a sense of how attempts by academics has drifted in the past 2 decades, having realized the need to teach courses that are policy-oriented. So you see what the University of Cape Coast is doing, what the University of Ghana is doing, and what GIMPA is doing. I put up a hypothesis that neither of these courses across these universities carefully and adequately put into context the 8 issues that are articulated. Dean, School of Economics, University of Cape Coast, with the MSc Economics Policy Modeling, which I was a part of, we developed, I can confidently say that does not take into consideration the 8 points. I have also highlighted a PhD Social Policy Studies at the University of Cape Coast, University of Ghana. I had the opportunity to look at the course titles, and my hypothesis is that it fails to take into consideration or adequately the 8 tenets that I've put forward. Ironically, these programs, including my own university, have struggled to get students. Vice Chancellor, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, 7 conclusions. Conceptualization, conceptual frameworks, it is not about a single variable intervention. I've clearly shown that. It is not about ratios. While admittedly I talk about tax GDP ratio, I go back to talk about the real sector. So you can use that as an indicator, so it is not about ratios. Economists pride themselves in the argument that we don't compute efficiency based on input and output. We compute efficiency based on a range of inputs and a range of outputs with different functions. I have espoused the complexities of conceptual frameworks. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's not about we knowing the complexities. It is about the populace appreciating the complexities. Otherwise, when the volatilities are not happening, they will say that the policy interventions are not occurring. Until the ordinary persons in Ghana appreciate the complexities around different macroeconomic variables, the volatilities will be seen as something different from a natural occurrence of the policies. The micro-macro linkages are pivotal. I demonstrated that from the poverty finance argument. The voices of the poor is critical. At the end of the day, the happiness, which we talked about, used for subjective measures. My conclusion is strong on the university side. Our programs fail to adequately integrate the tenets of policy capacity and practice based on the 8 issues that I've espoused. I'm yet to see a formal in-service training for our policymakers. duties. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'll conclude with two things. I'm not going to go into the details of that. The first is auditing the policies in the past. So I propose a simple framework. Let's do a stock taking of all our policies since independence. So this framework is starting with the import industrialization. Did we see the implementation of the intervention? Was the intervention meant to be a means to an end, or the intervention whether it happened or not? I said somehow. As I said, it's subjective. It's synonymous to the 1D, 1F. Did it achieve its end results? What do you expect after import substitution industrialization? Employment goes up, a steady state growth path with GDP. Ghana, if we had done the ISI way back in 1960, we wouldn't have seen the volatilities that occurred, specifically the contractions that occurred in 65 and 75, contractions as high as 12%. After import substitution industrialization occurred based on the Atalewis model. So I walk you through all that up until what we are seeing now, including planting for food and jobs. As I said, my responses are subjective. And if you go through my last column, I have two responses. Neither of the 21 do I say no. I either say somehow, or do I say yes? I either say somehow or no. I only say no when there's clear data that it did not achieve its intended goal. This is the 8th framework that I talked about. Chair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I've emphasized this. This is my take-home message. We need to begin to have a conversation around this, a criteria that will help us assess the capacity of policies. How do we debate policies in Parliament? Eventually, how do we ratify policies? How do academic institutions assess their policy recommendations? And I share with you this framework. So what I do here is a two-way assessment. So I have the 8 points in the middle. I have policy recommendations from the academic world on the left, and I have the policies that we've seen over the period on the right. And in each grade, whichever institution that is going to do that, if not the institution that I'm proposing, would say, yes, I met the space criteria. The policy that I've identified, which is related to my research recommendation, also met the space criteria, in which case I have a double tick in that grade. If my research recommendation is not identifiable with any policy recommendation, is not available. So you either say that my research recommendation identifies with space criteria, but I did not find any government policy academics will not be happy. But if I have my own way beyond publishing, we need to demonstrate how our policy recommendations align with government policies and whether they satisfy a criteria for debating national policies. Sitting on the fence that they are not hearing us, sitting on the fence that they are not abreast with reality, will take Ghana nowhere. On the basis of that, I go back to my take-home message. It has become imperative to redirect our proclivity in designing less data-informed and standalone policies to the rigor of conceptualization in terms of processes and assessment of their outcomes and their impact. And this is where we should be headed as a community, both from the academic point of view and policy-making point of view. These 6 points highlight the issues that would make this work. I'm proposing that this conversation should start with a non-partisan committee in Parliament. Eventually, it is not my proposal that they are going to constitute the last point, which I say is academic leaning, independent National Development Policy Institute. But for purposes of ownership and use, this conversation should start with our Parliament, where they begin to say that what criteria do we use in debating policies? My 8 points are just suggestive. They are not cast in stone. They are open to discussions, dropping, adding, but that conversation should start. Universities, higher learning institutions, this is a call for us to integrate policy science in the courses that we are mounting, be it standalone policy courses, teaching of research methods, or subject matter related areas. It should be the basis for translating our policy recommendations into policy actions. Chair, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the audience.
Please, we can do it better than this. Thank you very much, Professor Annim. You may take your seat. Prof has agreed to take a few questions from the audience, maximum of about, let's say, 3. He spent some time on the lecture, so if you have some questions, you raise your hand. Prof is prepared to attempt the question. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you, Prof. My name is Edmond Boy. We have spoken about tax versus GDP. But one thing we didn't touch on, it's party politics in relation to GDP. So maybe if we can also factor that as a variable that affects GDP. Our politicians come for only 4 years, then they are out with their policies to, when a new government comes into power, they either throw it away or continue it haphazardly. So we should have a relationship between our party politics and our GDP. Thank you.
Prof, are you going to take the 3 questions?
I'll take all the questions.
Okay, so question number 2, my man here in the middle.
Thank you very much, Prof, for a very distinguished lecture. I'm Dr. Kwame Ajay. I'm a retired researcher in economics and governance, University of Staffordshire, UK. I'm very fascinated in development economics and the topic you've just raised. Now, along the lines, I've been thinking about this particular question, or let me put it as a suggestion. In assessing outcomes and impact, and in also redesigning our growth divergence to the norm. Because you painted the picture that there is a dilemma. And so, in order for us to converge to that line where we're deviating from, would you propose that if the nation had had a national development plan over a long term, we as a nation could be discussing this issue and realigning gradually where we are deviating from. Thank you.
Next man, please, you identify yourself and
I'm
you.
Swali Swishaibu from National Investment Bank. Prof, looking at the conceptualization framework, you indicated that in 2000, the national debts, as compared to our current situation, in 2000 when we went to HIPIC, and looking at today, current situation, we are almost at the same level. So what is happening? Is it that we are back to HIPIC? Because you were saying that we should look at other variables. But when I checked the diagram, I realized that there was growth that was indicated. It means that when there is growth, we look at the growth for 2000 and then the growth for 2020. It means that the growth is higher currently than in 2000. But we shouldn't just limit ourselves to the debts alone. Secondly, you mentioned there was something like that concerning the national development planning. No, during the NDC era, they came out with a 40-year development plan. But in your presentation, it was vague. Nothing was mentioned about that. And what is happening to it? Is it that it is abandoned? What is happening to our developmental framework? Because we see that government they set up a long-term development plan. Another president probably when MPP came, they limited it to 10-year or 7-year development plan. So what is happening, and are we in the right path? I think these are.
Prof, I think you deal with the three.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the three questions are very well couched to help us discuss this beyond this lecture and also help us understand the context in which we need to continue with this conversation. The first question on how we integrate political issues into the computation of GDP, you always need to be clear in our minds why you want to have a statistic. And I'm happy I've given you two statistics that would help you look at it from either a subjective plus objective perspective or strictly an objective perspective. The computation of GDP, as we do in Ghana Statistical Service, is strictly an objective measure based on the value addition of your production, and this is what we capture. Once you bring in the political argument, there is some subjective element, things that you cannot easily quantify, and you are introducing that into your measurement of GDP. Nothing stops us as a country, and I need to commend the School of Economics that has started some conversations with Jeffrey Sachs on how we can collaborate, and one of the conversations is how can we develop our own happiness index or whatever index that would help us put together the different dimensions of development, happiness, or any indicator that we want to call it, be it satisfaction or whatever. But having said that, it's important to look at our progress, and that is why I made reference to the Osagyefo first statement. We can only measure our progress by the happiness that people get in managing their own lives. So as a country, with Ghana Statistical Service leading it, we're going to come up with indicators, as we've done, multidimensional poverty, which will help us look at issues of development from different perspectives. But this should not be the responsibility of only Ghana Statistical Service, but the entire national statistical system, like the Columbian University has done in the States, and hopefully the University of Cape Coast will do same. I'll jump to the question on debt before I come to the National Development Plan. What I wanted to show, if I can get a slide on debt, but essentially what I wanted to show had to do with what are you using as an argument to go in for a policy direction? Are you using the levels? In which case, if it's the levels, our current debt is just like what we had in 2000. Or you are using the growth. It will be misleading if you use only the levels. And if you want to use the growth, one of the things that I talked about is what is your initial condition? Once you vary your initial condition, your growth will change. So the essence of this lecture is for us to have a broader view in terms of what capacity do we have in initiating policies, understanding policies, and putting them in a context. So I'm nowhere saying that we should go for HIPIC. I don't do that. And that goes to the last question on whether we should go back to a long-term development plan or not. I don't think the response to that is dichotomous, yes or no. The response to that is what is going into your national development plan. Indeed, if you argue from the perspective that you can only track your progress over time, then on the surface of it, you need a national development plan. But what is more important is your appreciation of how those different policy instruments meet the 8-point criteria that I indicated. I indeed commended the coordinated program because the title says coordinated program. But if you go into the document, can we see the 8 issues reflecting in there? And one will be hesitant in saying yes to that. In any case, as a country, we are doing a national development plan by subscribing to the Agenda 2063, and depending on what you mean by long term, we are subscribing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, all the MDAs, MMDAs are aligning their strategies to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2063. So depending on the cap that you put on what a long term is, be it 20 years, 30 years, as a country, we are doing that indirectly. What we should do is what I've emphasized. What is going into it from the 8 issues that I've listed. Thank you.
We'll take 2 more questions, and that'll be all. Let's go to the right. The gentleman behind you. Oh my God. And you would take, the gentleman in suit, you take the next one. And I think behind the Vice Chancellor, we'll pick 1. Yes, you. And then I think I've just added 1 more. So that will be the ceiling. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for this lecture. My question is, you mentioned cost-benefit analysis. I see that in Ghana we spend a bit too much on projects and don't really analyze what the benefits are. Are you promising that in the near future you are going to come out with policies that will, let us say, for instance, know the benefit of free SHS, or say if we dualize the Accra-Kumasi Road, what the benefits are going to be? Thank you.
So we go to the right. And again, I humbly request that you introduce yourself. We should know who you are and where you're coming from. Thank you.
Please, my name is Charles, Reverend Charles Amanokomi, Department of Theology and Education. Prof, thanks a lot for your insightful and educative submission. Now, Prof, my question is that what are the main key components that trigger unhappiness to the individual and organization? Secondly, Prof, please, can you elaborate on your sentence, freedom to assess your life as a capacity indicator?
The last question from a gentleman here. Your name and where you're coming from.
Kofi Nyakon, Department of Geography, UCC. Prof, you are a member of NDPC, one of the members. Now, from your candid opinion, can you tell us, and based on whatever you've said, whether the members in NDPC also have the capacity to conceptualize and analyze policy? Because most of the members to committees are based on political alliance. So with your candid opinion, I want an answer. Thank you.
Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much. So we have questions from 3 people, but 4 of them. The argument, let me start by saying that the 8 issues that I've put out there require very detailed discussion. It's not just a matter of saying cost-benefit analysis, but to give you a quick sense of what we mean by cost-benefit analysis is from 2 perspectives. Our ability to quantify whatever we are putting into the intervention and the returns that we are getting from it. I do appreciate that it's not all that we can quantify, but at the minimum, we should articulate whatever cost that is going to bring, i.e. if it's going to bring dissatisfaction, unsettledness to people, and also whether the reverse is going to bring some satisfaction. We need to articulate this. So we need to do a full-scale cost-benefit analysis in terms of what is the direct cost of the intervention and what is the indirect cost of the intervention. And once you are thinking about the benefits too, as I indicated, you think about it at 3 levels. What are the immediate outputs, what are the outcomes, and what will be the impact? So you need to cost and determine the benefits at all 3 levels. And cost-benefit analysis is one of the sub-courses that people with economics background do, but it's very narrow, and once you are thinking about it from a policy point of view, you need to expand it, as I said, going beyond what you can quantify. The issue of on happiness, I did indicate from the start that I am not interrogating the numbers that we put out there. What number that is coming here, I've given you the source. So the happiness index is coming from a group of private researchers based in Columbia University, and they use 6 indicators in measuring happiness, or for that matter, unhappiness. GDP per capita, healthy life expectancy, and the 4 subjective measures: social support, freedom, corruption, and generosity. So these are the indices that they use in measuring happiness. The reason why I brought it into this lecture is the fluctuations or the marginal growth that we've seen in happiness over the period. Actually it's declined. It was 4.5 if you are using 2008 as the initial period, and it's now 4.4. But what I emphasize is the fact that we've seen volatilities over the period, and we see the same for our ranking, and also went ahead to talk about the unexplained part. So that is the context in which I brought in the happiness into this conversation. But again, this is something that I'm urging all of us to begin to think about. If we want to relate GDP to some other subjective indicator, then we have an in-country approach in doing that. In terms of the freedom in making life choices, I talked about it from 2 perspectives, making reference to what the first president said, subsequently quoted by the Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, from the perspective that we've known happiness 65 years ago, and we've known it from a metric-centric point of view. So it has to be measured. And one of the issues that he talks about is the freedom that you have, your ability to manage your own life. So from the Gallup's point of view, which is used in computing the happiness index, it's a very subjective indicator. As I said, they speak to about 1,000 people in a country each year with a simple question: are you satisfied with the way you make your own lifetime decisions? And then people will say yes or no. And based on that, they calculate the average for the country, and as that basis, compute the happiness index. I'll criticize it in the class, but for purposes of this lecture, I'm using it to demonstrate how happiness has fluctuated over the period. Then the last question, which I'll call it a trick question, is something that somebody with, as I indicated, my background is empirical data. My background is quantitative data. I cannot go to NDPC meeting and look at people's faces and say that because this party brought you in, you are not capable or you can't do it. If we really want to do that, there should be a well-defined criteria, and I'm happy you've brought this question up, really. What I mean by academic-leaning National Data Policy Institute is the criteria for getting people there should be well-defined. And throughout my 3 lectures, this recommendation is there. And eventually, I'm going to say that for you to go there, it's not because you are a presidential appointee. As we heard from the Vice Chancellor, from the Chair, you should be part of X number of bodies. You should have demonstrated that your research policy recommendations have fed into policy. We should sit down and have a criteria to say that these are people who have to just assess policies. They are not making policies, and advise Parliament that these are the cost benefits, these are the spaces, these are the mixes, so these are the consequences, do it or otherwise. Thank you.
I may have to come back to Prof again, because we are streaming this lecture online, and I've had 2 questions from those who are actually watching online. But before I ask their questions, the questioning time has been dominated by people like me, men. I've seen a lady's hand up for a long time, and I would like to give her the opportunity to ask her question. So I'll ask our lady at the far end to ask your question, and then I'll read out the questions from people online to Prof. So, your question.
My name is Dr. Gloria Clarissa Jeha. You said something which has been baffling me as I sat down. We've been using world development indicators all through, but you said something to the effect that there's a bit of discrepancy in the data that Ghana Statistical Services put out there in terms of the CPI, the inflation figures. You said 142 as against 302. For me, I think that the magnitude in terms of the difference is quite high. And so that would definitely have effect on our results. What do you advise? For some of us who are really, leaning towards the use of world development indicators, do we actually have to look at it again, or we stick to, if we are doing a country study on Ghana, do we stick to Ghana Statistical Service data? What do you advise, please? Thank you.
Question 2 here from Kobina Mensa, who is watching or listening online. And his question is, does our current population growth, the nation's population growth, affect our economic development? Then the second question from Francis Bentel reads, to what extent do we examine international influence on policy guidelines on the economy? Thank you. I think this is all we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, these 3 questions are pretty important, especially with the first one. So, Chair, let me spend a bit of time on that because it's important. As I indicated, that'll be the focus for the inaugural lecture, where I try to show discrepancies in different data sets, both within an institution and across different institutions. Time did not permit me to explain this in detail across the different variables, but one of the variables that I talked about is the effect on real minimum wage. In 2020, the nominal minimum wage was 11.82. Using the World Development Indicator of 305, we see that we dropped to about 3.6 Ghana cedis from the 11.82 nominal wage to 3.6 real minimum wage. Then if you use the 1124 from Ghana Statistical Service, it drops from the 11.82 to just about 9, indicating a drop of just about 2 Ghana cedis. Where the differences is coming about, 2 things at the minimum. One is standardizing across the countries. So that is what WDI does, and that is why it is important for Ghana to do its own computation. So whatever analysis that you are doing, if you are using that data, for instance, if you are doing a cross-country analysis, you cannot use data from GSS for the cross-country analysis. That WDI data, which has been standardized based on the same adjustment factor, would be ideal data to use. On the other hand, if you are thinking about a country-specific analysis, it's important to use what we have in the country. And why these differences are coming about is not necessarily that WDI is wrong or Ghana Statistical Service is wrong. What I was not able to explain in detail in terms of time is how real effective exchange rate has varied. When I was preparing for this exercise, I got real effective exchange rate from two sources, UNCTAD and World Development Indicators. World Development Indicators is using 2010 as the base year, so it puts 2010 to 0 and calculates, to 100, and calculates the real effective exchange rate accordingly. Whereas WDI is using 2010 and UNCTAD is using 2005. So if you use the UNCTAD data, you get rates very different from what WDI is giving to us. And that is why we emphasize the need to look at the metadata anytime you are doing analysis. You don't just pick data because it has the same variable across. But I'm definitely happy to speak to this in more detail bilaterally. The second question, I like it. It's unfortunate I had to trim down the slides. I know I even went beyond my allotted time. But one of the slides that I had was our population since 1960, intercensal population growth rate, our GNI per capita, and how the GNI per capita has changed over time. And once you see the population growth rate and GNI per capita, it clearly confirms that policy is not informing what you are doing. They are moving in different directions. So there is no way our current 2.1 population growth rate would one day be said to have informed whatever GDP per capita, which currently stands about $2,300 for Ghana is. Other factors are coming to play. So that traditional Malthusian argument of population growth, income moving in some same constant direction is yet to be experienced in Ghana. The third question is worth discussing. I talked about the HIPIC impact on it, on whatever we are seeing now. It wouldn't be the first time that the international influence is there. Indeed, it is one of the reasons why I made reference to the policy science paper. If you recall, I talked about the policy entrepreneurial skills and the political acumen. And it's one of the things that I talked about had to do with negotiation. So if you go there, you need it. What is your situation? What data do you have? Then you go ahead in negotiating for what you have. But all boils down to the data that you are using and the data that we also have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. As Prof takes his seat, let's give him a big hand for an excellent lecture. Prof, thank you so much. You may take your seat as I call the chairman of the function to give his closing remarks. Thank you very much, Prof.
What can I say? My ignorance has been demonstrated to myself, that there are many things that I don't know, and I'm happy to learn. I'm a humble psychologist, and therefore, when you see some of those graphs and those figures, you quake and you wonder whether you also went to school or not. Professor, thank you very much. I'm proud to have you as Ghana's government statistician, and I'm deeply proud to have you as a colleague commissioner at the National Labour Planning Commission. Thank you so very much. Let me start by blowing our own horn at Central University. Two things. We're a private university, and I'm happy that despite the fact that we're a private university, functions like this are taking place here. This is not the first. And we will continue in this light. Debates such as this energize us, they energize our world, and we are happy to contribute in this area. I have sat in many lectures and many interactions such as this, and I've noted the tendency, the proclivity, to quote his word, of chairpersons to try and summarize lectures. As I said, I'm a humble psychologist. I will not try to summarize, lest I make my ignorance even more clear. All I will say is that I am touched by the fact that the data shows that there is a lot of work that we have to do. A lot of effort has to go into it. I am touched also by the fact that he made clear that 40% of happiness is as yet unexplained by the data. For myself as a psychologist and a person of faith, I lean towards saying there is something out there that we are yet to put our finger on. You've also touched on the matter of happiness so much, and I'm happy to note that happiness is a very subjective matter of interpretation. And I recently, just about 2-3 weeks ago, was prompted to meet, I think, our Department of Social Sciences, Dr. Entry, am I right, to talk exactly about this matter and to ask our colleague faculty members to look at how they can look at happiness, combining the economics of it, the spirituality of it, and the data that you see. So I'm happy that you've mentioned it. Perhaps we will collaborate with the School of Economics at Cape Coast and see how we can together pull our heads together in this area. Thank you very much for your lecture, sir. The confidence with which you speak tells me that we do have academics who know how to walk the fine line between government appointment, the political space, and the data. Thank you. This is what emerges very, very clearly to me. And I trust that the powers that be will be happy that they appointed you as government statistician, and the powers that be will be happy to note the many things that you say. Colleagues, I thank you so very much for coming to today's lecture. I had several notes, but as I said, if I start going through the notes, my ignorance will be explained and shown forth, and I don't want that to happen. Me too, I have some stripes on my shoulder, so I shouldn't show that I don't know too much. So we will end it here. I also like to say that in exactly 1 month from today, 1 month and a week actually from today, on May 25th, we'll have our next lecture, and that will be by Professor Johnny Japong, Vice Chancellor of UHAS. And he's going to be talking about COVID and whether we are out of the woods yet with COVID. I encourage all of us to come, and I encourage us to continue to engage the debates that Professor Samuel Annim has raised with us today. Thank you, and thank you, and thank you again, sir. Thank you very much.
In our local parlance, we say that onipa yadea ose ayeyi. So at this point, I'm going to ask Professor Adelaide Kassner to give the vote of thanks, after which, because we started with an opening prayer, we will have a closing prayer, and that will be given by Dr. Gloria Zeha. So, Prof.
Professor Chair, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Chancellor of Central University, in the person of Dr. Mensah Otabil, also on behalf of the Council Chairperson, Mrs. Florence Hatchful, and then indeed on behalf of our Vice Chancellor, in the person of Professor Bill Buena Puplampu, who has so well chaired today's lecture, I express our profound gratitude to Professor Samuel Kobina Annim for such an insightful lecture. I think the chair for this lecture spoke my mind in the sense that he said a lot of the indices that were being discussed, went over the top of some of, us, our heads. But I would say that it is the beginning of learning about such indices, and we would like to hear more. I really appreciated the need for Professor Samuel Annim's disclaimer as he progressed with his lecture. And I think your guess would be as good as mine. The objectivity with which he spoke and how he dissected the data and deduced out of the data, obviously, he was not talking political language. He was talking economics. Prof, thank you very much for that illumination. We are very grateful that you have spoken so eloquently on conceptualization of national policies. It is our hope that your proposed framework for evaluating policies will be adopted to improve policy formulation and the impact on Ghana's socioeconomic growth and consequently our happiness. We are also most grateful to you, our audience, for being here, and we indeed hope that the lecture has increased your knowledge on how Ghana can improve on its well-being, and you'll share the knowledge with other people. We wish you safe journeys to your destinations, and God bless us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kastner. As I mentioned earlier, there are some few dignitaries with us here that I would like to acknowledge. The list is not exhaustive, so if it happens that I miss your name, please, it's not out of ill intention. We have with us here the Deputy. First, I should start with our chairperson. I think Professor Poplampo introduced her already, but we have with us here our Chairperson of Council in the person of Mrs. Florence Hatchford. Prof, let's acknowledge you. Yes, thank you very much for coming to Grace's occasion. We have the Deputy Government Statistician here with us. Sir, Madam. We also have a representative for the MD of Prudential Bank with us here. We have the Dean School of Economics, UCC. We have reps from NHI. Are they here with us? Oh. Then we have Henry Osei of Kruger Brent Security. Thanks for coming. We appreciate all of you. At this stage, we take the closing prayer, and I'll give some housekeeping announcement. Doc.
Shall we kindly rise up and say that? Our Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for such a wonderful moment that we've had even this evening. Father, we are so grateful unto you for this knowledge, this insights that has been shared with us by Prof, even this evening. Thank you, O God, that Lord, by these insights, our eyes of understanding has been enlightened. And Lord, we are going to apply our hearts to wisdom as we go as academics, we ask that with the fortitude of mind and hearts, we will search and we will research. And at the end of it all, the policy recommendations that we make will align even to the policy of this nation. We pray that, Lord, out of us, a great nation shall be built. Great institution, such as our university, shall be built. May your name alone be glorified, and may your name alone be praised. We thank you so much for what you have accomplished with us tonight. We are so grateful. In Jesus' name we have prayed. Amen.
Please take your seat. A short housekeeping announcement. There will be refreshment at the auditorium extension for all participants, for all the audience here. We have refreshment at the auditorium extension. The ushers will direct you to the auditorium extension. We've come far this afternoon. We thank you so much for coming. As the Vice Chancellor said, we'll be expecting you to come. Please share the message with your colleagues that the lecture series that we've begun here is super. And bring them along. We'd like to see all of you. Let's fill this auditorium during the next lecture. Thank you so much, and may God bless you all. Thank you.